The room was alive with whispers. Not loud enough to disturb the judge, but constant, like the low hum of a storm pressing against glass. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting fractured beams across the polished oak floor. Dust particles drifted in the air, catching the light as if suspended in time. Every creak of a chair, every shuffle of a uniformed officer's boot, seemed magnified in the tension-filled silence. It smelled of polish and of fear. Colonel Renata Blackwood, presiding judge, sat high at the bench, stern, razor-featured, her black robes falling around her like armor. Her gavel rested within reach, a weapon of order. She was known for her sharpness, for cutting through pretense with surgical precision. Today would be no different, or so she thought. At the defense table sat Major Robert Kane, a decorated officer, 15 years in uniform. His posture was rigid, his jaw locked. Once a proud figure in dress blues, now he looked smaller, diminished, like a man carrying an invisible weight pressing down on his chest. He wasn't here for glory. He was here for survival. Across from him, the prosecution burned bright with youth. Lieutenant Michael Rhodes, junior attorney with ambition written in his every gesture, hammered at exhibits with a confidence he hadn't fully earned yet. Maps spread out before him, tactical plans pinned to boards. He spoke with the certainty of someone who believed the law was on his side, his words echoing in the chamber. Major Kane, Rhodes declared, stabbing a finger toward the evidence, ignored established extraction protocol. His decision left 5 good men stranded in hostile territory, dead because of negligence, dead because he quit. The words rang out, heavy as bullets. The spectators shifted in their seats, some skeptical, some grim. To the families of the fallen, Kane was the man who had abandoned their loved ones. To others, he was a scapegoat, pinned beneath the gears of something larger. And in the back row, almost invisible, sat Emma Navarro. She looked like anyone. Dark hair pulled neatly into a knot at the nape of her neck. A navy blazer, modest blouse, plain black shoes. No makeup, no jewelry. Just an ordinary woman, mid-40s, unassuming, blending into the background. She held a small leather-bound notebook in her hands, her pen gliding across the page in steady strokes. If you glanced her way, you might think she was a journalist or perhaps a law student taking notes. But her eyes told another story. They were too calm, too watchful. The eyes of someone who had already seen war and survived it. Rhodes continued his charge, voice tightening with manufactured passion. He painted Kane as a coward, a man who chose caution over loyalty. The courtroom leaned forward, hanging on each word. Emma didn't move, didn't flinch. Only the faint tightening of her fingers around her pen betrayed anything stirring inside her. Then came the moment. Prosecution calls its next witness, Rhodes announced. His voice, sharp as a blade, cut through the air. Heads turned as Emma quietly closed her notebook. She rose from her seat with deliberate grace, her movements calm, steady, almost too steady. A ripple of surprise moved through the room. No one had expected her. The court calls, Emma Navarro. The silence deepened. She walked to the stand, heels clicking softly against polished wood. Her posture was straight, almost military. Though dressed as a civilian, there was something about the way she carried herself, shoulders squared, chin lifted just slightly, that unsettled those watching. Colonel Blackwood's eyes narrowed. She didn't like surprises. Emma placed her hand on the oath, her voice soft when she swore to tell the truth. Too soft. The court reporter leaned forward, straining to catch her words. Please state your name and occupation for the record, Colonel Blackwood instructed. Emma Navarro, civilian contractor. Intelligence analysis. Her tone was gentle, precise, barely louder than a whisper. Lieutenant Rhodes stepped forward. Ms. Navarro, could you explain your involvement in the intelligence assessment for Operation Storefall? I reviewed imagery and field reports, Emma replied. Her voice so quiet it forced the room to lean in. I highlighted terrain risks and militia discrepancies. And what was your conclusion? That additional reconnaissance was necessary before the mission. Was your recommendation followed? No. The exchange was simple, almost clinical. Yet each answer landed like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples spreading, unsettling the calm. Rhodes pressed further, but her soft voice kept the court reporter frowning, leaning closer to the machine. Finally, Colonel Blackwood's patience snapped. "Ms. Navarro," she interrupted sharply. "The court reporter cannot hear you. Speak louder." Emma lifted her gaze to meet the colonel's. Calm, unshaken. "Yes, Your Honor." But her voice barely rose. Blackwood's eyes narrowed further, irritation giving way to something else. Something closer to recognition? The defense attorney, Major Elias Thorne, stood next. Tall, commanding, his silver temples giving him an air of authority. He approached with a thin smile that carried just enough arrogance to irritate anyone watching. "Ms. Navarro," he said smoothly, "what exactly was your role in Operation Stormfall? You weren't in the field. You weren't in command. You merely read reports." Emma's expression didn't change. "I had clearance for the intelligence provided to me. My role was analysis." Thorne let out a small, mocking laugh. "And yet, here you are, suggesting your assessment outweighed the judgment of experienced officers on the ground." "Objection," Rhodes cut in too fast. "Sustained," Colonel Blackwood replied, but her eyes stayed fixed on Emma. The air shifted. The tension thickened. Major Thorne pressed again, lowering his tone so it cut sharper. "Tell us, Ms. Navarro, what direct field experience do you have? What makes you qualified to sit in this courtroom and second-guess the men who bled for their country?" Emma paused, just for a moment, and in that pause you could feel the air tighten like the pull of a bowstring. Her eyes flicked almost imperceptibly toward the gallery, toward a silver-haired veteran seated near the front. Then she answered evenly, "My field experience is classified." A ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Thorne smirked. "How convenient." Colonel Blackwood leaned forward, her patience thinning, her voice sharp. "Ms. Navarro, if you are to testify in my courtroom, you will speak clearly. This is your final warning." The room grew still. Every officer shifted slightly in their seat. Every civilian held their breath. Emma Navarro's hands rested lightly on the wooden rail of the witness stand. Her eyes met the colonel's. Calm, steady, a flicker of something unreadable passing between them. Then she leaned closer to the microphone and whispered. What did Emma whisper into that microphone? And why did those few quiet words freeze every soldier in that courtroom like they'd seen a ghost? Her lips barely moved. Her words were soft, almost tender. But they hit the room like an explosion. Sierra 12. Phantom Alpha. For a heartbeat, no one understood. Then silence devoured the courtroom. The gavel slipped from Colonel Blackwood's fingers, clattering against her desk. Officers stiffened like they'd been struck by invisible lightning. Papers fluttered to the ground, forgotten. The color drained from Major Kane's face, leaving him pale, hollow-eyed. And in the gallery, the silver-haired veteran, Colonel Octavian Vega, rose halfway to his feet before sinking back down, his hands trembling as they gripped the bench in front of him. The air was no longer heavy with law and order. It was haunted, because no one had expected a ghost to testify. Emma Navarro's voice remained quiet, but now every ear strained desperately to catch it. Her words carried more power than the prosecutor's booming accusations or the defense's sharp retorts. They carried memory. They carried blood. "I was there," she said softly. "Stormfall wasn't my first mission. 3 years earlier, I led the extraction team on Operation Phantom Sierra." Whispers rippled through the chamber like wind through dry grass. Some scoffed. Others froze. A few exchanged sharp glances, eyes widening in recognition. "That's impossible," one young officer muttered from the back. Phantom Sierra was buried, classified beyond. He stopped himself, realizing too late what he'd said. Colonel Blackwood's gavel pounded once, hard. "Order." Her voice shook just slightly. But order had already broken. Emma reached into her bag with slow, deliberate movements. When her hand emerged, she held a small, battered notebook. Its cover was scarred, torn. The edges darkened with what looked chillingly like dried blood. "This," she said, her tone steady now, isn't hearsay. These are my field notes. Every coordinate, every transmission, every order we received, before they abandoned us. Major Thorne, the defense attorney, laughed, but the sound was strained, brittle. Abandoned? Ms. Navarro, that's a heavy word. Phantom Sierra never existed. And even if it had, you expect us to believe you survived what official reports declared a total loss. Emma lifted her eyes and met his with a calm that cut deeper than rage. They declared me dead. They buried an empty coffin. But here I stand. The words fell into the courtroom like stones into still water. Colonel Vega finally spoke, his voice hoarse. Those eyes, he leaned forward, whispering more to himself than anyone else. No one forgets those eyes. The tension was suffocating now. Even the court reporter's fingers had stilled above the keys, suspended in disbelief. Lieutenant Rhodes, who had called Emma as a witness, looked rattled for the first time. His ambition had thrived on control, but now he stood in the middle of something far larger than the trial he thought he was winning. He swallowed hard. Ms. Navarro, if you truly were part of Phantom Sierra, explain this to the court. Why come forward now? Why wait 3 years in silence? Emma glanced around the courtroom, at the officers shifting uneasily in their seats, at Kane sitting like a man seeing a ghost, at Blackwood gripping her bench so tightly her knuckles whitened. Because lies have long shadows, Emma said, and truth demands patience. A hush fell again, but it was different now. Not silence of disbelief, silence of dread. Colonel Blackwood straightened in her chair, her voice sharper, though still unsteady. Enough of riddles, Ms. Navarro. Speak plainly. What is it you claim happened on Phantom Sierra? Emma leaned closer to the microphone, her voice lowering to that dangerous softness again. My team was sent to track the flow of advanced American weapons appearing in enemy hands. We found the source. We transmitted evidence. And then, she paused, her gaze sliding across the room until it landed on Kane. Our extraction was canceled. Direct orders. Major Kane jolted upright, shaking his head. That's not, his voice broke. He tried again, quieter. That's not what I was told. Emma's expression didn't change. Her words were calm, almost too calm. They told you we were already dead. The gallery erupted with gasps, murmurs rising like thunder. Colonel Blackwood's gavel struck again, but this time her hand trembled. Quiet. Emma opened her notebook. The sound of its worn pages scraping against each other was louder than the murmurs, louder than the gavel, louder than the judge's command. She held up a photograph, a bombed-out compound, jagged walls jutting against the sky. Her eyes lingered on it, just long enough for emotion to flicker across her otherwise stoic face. This was the extraction point. The place we were told would be safe. The place where 5 of my people died calling for support that never came. She turned another page, revealing scribbled coordinates, field codes, diagrams of supply routes. The intel you've been shown is not the truth. These, she tapped the notebook, are the orders we actually received. The courtroom stilled. For a long moment, no one breathed. Then Emma whispered the words that cracked the last layer of silence. The fault isn't Major Kane's. He followed orders. The betrayal came from higher. Her eyes shifted to the judge, boring into Colonel Blackwood. From General Warren Hadfield himself. The silence that followed was no longer disbelief. It was horror. If Emma is telling the truth, then the court isn't just trying Major Kane for negligence. It has stumbled into a conspiracy that reaches far beyond the room. But can she prove it, or will the system bury her twice? The courtroom was no longer a place of law. It was a battlefield, silent, breathless, waiting for the next shot to be fired. And Emma Navarro held the weapon. Her notebook, scarred and bloodstained, rested on the stand like a relic pulled from a grave. Every page she turned was another round loaded. Every word she spoke aimed with precision. Major Elias Thorne, the defense attorney, tried to seize back control. He paced slowly, his polished shoes echoing across the floor, his voice sharp and mocking. Ms. Navarro, he said, you claim you led an operation that the Department of Defense itself declared never existed. Are you suggesting the entire United States military lied? Emma didn't blink. I'm saying the truth was buried with my team. Thorne smirked, his silver-templed head cocking slightly, as if he were indulging a child. And you alone conveniently survived? The silver-haired veteran in the gallery, Colonel Vega, stirred. His hand clenched against the wood before him, jaw tightening. He had trained those ghosts. Yes, Emma said simply. I survived. And I remember every order, every scream, every silence when the radio went dead. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The soft delivery forced the entire room to lean forward, straining to catch every syllable. Colonel Blackwood, perched at the bench, shifted uncomfortably. The lines of authority on her face cracked for just a second. Rhodes, the prosecutor, approached cautiously. His earlier bravado was gone, replaced with something between awe and unease. Ms. Navarro, he asked, for the record, explain what your team uncovered. Emma's hand brushed the notebook as though steadying herself on it. When she spoke, her words carried weight heavier than gunfire. We traced stolen weapons to a warehouse near Tabri. Prototypes. American prototypes. My communications officer, Staff Sergeant Reeves, decoded manifests, linking them directly to a private contractor. That contractor worked for General Hadfield. Gasps scattered through the room like sparks. Emma turned a page. Photographs. Grainy, black and white, but damning, crate stamped with serial numbers, papers bearing seals. Reeves was the one who found it. He died trying to send the transmission out. We all did. Except me. Her voice caught barely, but enough that the silence deepened. Families in the gallery leaned forward, faces pale, eyes wide. They had come to watch a negligence trial. Instead, they were hearing the voices of their dead brought back through Emma's trembling calm. Colonel Blackwood gripped her gavel, but didn't strike it. Her face, usually stone, now cracked with something raw. Recognition, memory, guilt. You're saying, she began, but her voice faltered. You're saying the abort order was deliberate? Emma's eyes locked on hers. Yes. And the order was signed with your name. The gavel finally dropped. One sharp crack that did nothing to calm the chaos. Voices exploded around the chamber, soldiers and civilians alike muttering, questioning, disbelieving. Blackwood raised her voice, cutting through the storm. That's impossible. Emma reached deeper into her bag and produced another sheet. An authorization form, edges creased, ink smudged but legible. This, she said, holding it high, is your genuine authorization for Phantom Sierra. And this, she produced a second sheet, its ink darker, its signature just slightly off, is the abort order. Forged. The color drained from Blackwood's face. Her hand shook as she took both papers, eyes darting between them. Someone used my name. Colonel Vega stood then, his voice booming with the authority of a man who had trained generations of soldiers. I always knew you wouldn't have left them, Renata. This proves it. Blackwood's jaw clenched, her mask cracking entirely. For years, she had carried the weight of betrayal on her conscience. Now, before her eyes, it was shifting. Emma opened her notebook again. From within its scarred pages, she pulled a small metal canister. Microfilm. She set it gently on the stand. It looked small, insignificant, but everyone in that courtroom understood it carried the weight of lives. These, she said, her voice quiet but steady, are the transaction records. Serial numbers, bank transfers, all tying Hadfield to the network that armed our enemies. Major Kane's voice finally broke through, hoarse, desperate. I was told you were already gone, that the team was confirmed Kia. Emma looked at him. Her expression softened just slightly. I heard your voice on the comm that day. You sounded confused. You questioned the order. But you followed it. You thought you had no choice. His face crumpled, years of buried guilt flooding into his eyes. Then Emma spoke words that froze the blood of every man and woman in uniform present. My name is not just Emma Navarro. My call sign was Raven, commander of Sierra Unit, extraction specialist, the only survivor of Phantom Sierra. The courtroom erupted. Some shouted impossible. Others rose in disbelief. The younger officers looked pale, while the veterans looked stricken, because they knew. They remembered. Colonel Vega stepped forward, his voice shaking but resolute. She's telling the truth. I trained her. I buried her. And now she stands here. The gavel pounded, but it was drowned by the rising storm. Emma's final words before the recess cut through it all, sharp as a blade. Major Kane isn't guilty of negligence. He's guilty of trusting a system that betrayed us all. And then she set the notebook down, like a soldier laying a weapon on the table. If Phantom Sierra's betrayal was real, then this trial isn't about negligence anymore. It's about treason. But how far will the conspiracy reach? And who in that room already knows more than they're admitting? The silence before the storm was gone. Now the courtroom throbbed with chaos. Officers muttered, some rising to their feet. Families of the fallen leaned forward, clutching at each other as if the ground itself was shifting beneath them. The gavel slammed down again and again, but Colonel Blackwood's authority was a broken shield. Every strike sounded weaker, every command drowned by the swell of voices. And at the center of it all, Emma Navarro stood with her blood-stained notebook. Still, unshaken. Her presence filled the room more than any uniform or rank could. General Hadfield, she repeated, louder this time. The name hissed through the chamber like gasoline on fire. A young officer near the back sprang up. His face was pale, his voice desperate. This is absurd. Commander Navarro died in Phantom Sierra. I attended her memorial service. All eyes turned to him. Before the judge could bark him down, Colonel Vega's voice cut through, low and iron-heavy. Sit down, Captain. The officer froze. Vega's gaze stayed locked on Emma. His voice softened, but it carried. Look at her eyes. You don't forget those eyes. The captain's mouth shut. He sat down slowly, his face ashen. Colonel Blackwood finally rose from the bench, standing tall despite the tremor in her hands. She looked directly at Emma. Commander Navarro, she said, her voice sharp but strained, this court demands order. You are not authorized to disclose classified operations. Emma cut her off, her tone calm but relentless. With respect, Colonel, I buried authorization along with my team. What I carry now is truth. The colonel flinched at the word, as though struck. For 3 years, she had carried the ghost of Phantom Sierra on her shoulders, believing she had condemned 5 soldiers to their deaths. Now the truth was tearing at her carefully built armor. Emma opened the notebook again, flipping to a final set of pages. She lifted 2 documents, one authorization with Blackwood's clean signature, and another, the forged aboard order, the ink too sharp, the flow unnatural. The signatures don't match, she said, laying them side by side. Colonel Blackwood, you didn't sign the order that killed my team. Someone forged your hand. The colonel staggered back a step. Her lips parted, but no words came. Vega's voice broke the moment. I knew it. Renata, I knew you'd never abandon them. For the first time, Colonel Blackwood's facade shattered. Her voice cracked, low and raw. I've carried this guilt for years, believing I failed them. She turned to Emma, eyes glassy. And it was never my choice. The revelation rippled through the courtroom like a seismic wave. The doors at the rear of the chamber banged open. Every head snapped toward the sound as a column of military police marched in, led by a broad-shouldered officer with iron-gray eyes and a stern jaw. His voice boomed, cutting through the uproar with ease. Brigadier General Marcus Foster, Inspector General's office. The room fell into stunned silence. Even the gavel stilled in Colonel Blackwood's trembling hand. Foster's gaze swept the chamber before locking onto Emma. We received an anonymous package yesterday containing evidence of high-level breaches of military law. Documents, transaction logs, names. It all points to General Warren Hadfield. Gasps again. A rising tide of disbelief and dread. Emma allowed herself the faintest smile. Right on time, she murmured. General Foster stepped closer, his eyes narrowing on Emma. You would be Commander Navarro. I would. He nodded once, curtly. Then you and I have a great deal to discuss. But first, he turned toward the bench. Colonel Blackwood, with the court's permission, I am taking immediate custody of the evidence presented today, and Commander Navarro will remain under protection until a full investigation can proceed. Blackwood hesitated, then nodded slowly. Granted. The words were strained, heavy with everything she now understood. Major Kane hadn't moved. He sat frozen at the defense table, his face pale, his eyes hollow. The accusation that had haunted him for 3 years, that he was a coward, that his decision had killed his team, was unraveling before him. But with unraveling came the realization. He had been just another pawn. Emma stepped toward him, her voice quiet enough that only he could hear. You questioned the order 3 times. Kane's eyes snapped to hers. How could you possibly know that? His voice broke. Those transmissions were encrypted. Emma's gaze softened, the smallest ghost of a smile tugging at her lips. I wasn't the only one who survived. Not everyone inside intelligence was compromised. Some voices wanted the truth. He swallowed hard, his hands trembling on the table. Then I wasn't alone. No, Emma said gently. You were betrayed, just like us. In the gallery, the families of the fallen soldiers were in tears. A woman clutched the memorial pin of her daughter. A father bowed his head, his jaw clenched against years of pain. They had come here to watch a stranger's trial, never knowing their loved one's ghosts would walk the room again. Emma turned to them, her voice carrying with solemn weight. They weren't victims of negligence. They were silenced because they discovered the truth. Their courage threatened men who sold weapons for profit, men like General Hadfield. The woman's voice broke the silence, trembling but firm. You knew my son? Emma's eyes softened. Yes. Staff Sergeant Reeves. He cracked the code that exposed the network. He died making sure the truth got out. The mother wept openly, clutching her hands over her heart. Colonel Vega stepped forward, his voice thick. I trained him. He was one of the best. General Foster raised a hand, signaling his MPs. Hadfield is being taken into custody as we speak. This corruption runs deep, but today we begin cutting it out. The storm had broken, and Emma Navarro had lit the first crack of thunder. With Hadfield exposed and the courtroom in ruins, Emma must face the families of her fallen team, return what she carried for them, and decide what comes next. But survival is one thing, healing is another. The storm had passed. What remained was silence. Heavy, exhausted silence. The courtroom, moments ago alive with chaos, now looked like the aftermath of a battlefield. Papers scattered across polished oak. Families still trembling in the gallery. Colonel Blackwood, her once impenetrable mask shattered, sat slumped in her chair, staring at the forged order in her hands. Emma Navarro stood in the middle of it all, her notebook pressed against her chest. For 3 years, she had carried its weight. For 3 years, it had been her only weapon. Now, for the first time, it felt lighter. Major Robert Kane rose slowly from the defense table. He looked like a man learning how to breathe again. I don't understand, he whispered, his voice raw. Why would you help me? I was the one who called off your extraction. I left your team behind. Emma turned, her eyes soft. No, Major. You were another casualty of the same corruption. You followed what you believed were real orders. The blame rests with those who forged them, not you. He shook his head, his jaw trembling. But I still hear it, your voices on the comm begging. I thought I damned you all. Emma's hand brushed his shoulder. I heard yours too. You asked for confirmation 3 times. That's not cowardice. That's a soldier's instinct that something was wrong. You were manipulated. For the first time in years, Major Kane allowed himself to cry. At the back, families of the fallen sat frozen, caught between disbelief and the fragile bloom of hope. Emma stepped toward them, her hands trembling slightly as she opened a small waterproof case she had carried for years. Inside were relics, pieces of lives cut short, a compass worn smooth from use, a lucky coin, edges nicked, a faded photograph, corners curled. Dog tags, heavy in her palm. A folded letter, ink blurred by sweat and blood. She approached a grieving father who wore his daughter's memorial pin. Emma's voice softened to a whisper. Lieutenant Farron, your daughter was our medic. She treated my wounds before the building collapsed. Her last act was tying a tourniquet that saved my life." The man's lips quivered, his eyes wet. "That sounds like her." Emma pressed the dog tags into his hand. She never gave up, even at the end. The father clutched them like a lifeline. Next, Emma knelt before a woman whose eyes mirrored her son's photograph. She held out the compass. "He always carried this," Emma said gently. "He was the one who cracked the manifests that exposed the weapons network. He saved us all that night. And when the building fell, I kept this safe for him. For you." The woman closed her hands around the compass, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He always knew his way home." Emma smiled faintly. "And through me he found it." The gallery was no longer silent. It was full of weeping, full of whispered names, full of the raw ache of remembrance. Colonel Blackwood rose slowly, her robes hanging heavy on her shoulders. She approached Emma, her voice low, trembling. "For 3 years, I believed I was the one who condemned your team. I believed the blood was on my hands." She held up the forged board order, her voice cracking. "But this proves I never gave that command." Emma looked into her eyes, steady and unyielding. "You've carried guilt that was never yours, Colonel. It's time to lay it down." The colonel nodded, tears slipping free. She removed her gavel, placed it gently on the bench, and descended to stand at Emma's level. For the first time, not as judge, but as equal. Colonel Vega, his voice thick with pride and sorrow, stepped forward. "Commander Navarro," he said formally, then dropped his tone. "Emma, you were one of the finest I ever trained. What you did today, it honors them." He straightened his posture and rendered a perfect salute. Slowly, one by one, the soldiers in the courtroom followed. Uniforms stiffened. Hands rose to brows. A ripple of silent honor moved through the chamber until even Blackwood herself stood at attention, saluting the ghost returned to life. Emma did not cry, but her throat tightened as she returned the gesture, her hand steady as steel. Brigadier General Foster approached. "Commander Navarro," he said, his voice firm, "the Pentagon will want a full debrief. There will be investigations, hearings. Hadfield's allies will not go quietly." Emma nodded. "I'll be ready. But first," she turned toward the families still gathered. "These people deserve the truth their loved ones died for. They come first." Foster studied her for a moment, then inclined his head. 1 hour. Then we move you to secure custody." Emma nodded. As the sun sank low, painting long gold shadows across the courthouse steps, Emma finally walked outside. The air was cool, sharp against her skin. For 3 years, she had lived hidden in shadows. Now, she walked in the open, every eye on her. Colonel Vega caught up with her just before she reached the waiting vehicle. His voice was quiet, reverent. "What you did, surviving. Gathering evidence, coming forward, it was extraordinary." Emma's lips curved faintly. "I had a duty to my team." "No," Vega said softly. "It was more than duty. It was courage." Emma allowed herself a rare, small smile. "You taught us well, Colonel." Vega shook his head. "I taught you tactics. What you showed today came from within." Behind her, the families clutched their keepsakes. Major Kane stood alone, still processing his release. Colonel Blackwood lingered on the courthouse steps, the weight of false guilt finally slipping from her shoulders. Emma looked back once. Then she stepped into the waiting vehicle. The door closed. The engine started. For 3 years she had been a ghost, living in silence. Her only companions, the memories of those she lost. Now she carried something else. Something heavier, but purer. Truth. And as the vehicle pulled away, sunlight glinting off its windows, Emma Navarro allowed herself to breathe. Not as a survivor, not as a ghost, but as a soldier who had kept her promise. The truth was finally free. And the shadows, at last, had given way to light. What about you? If you were in Emma's place, torn between silence and the truth, knowing it could cost you everything, what would you have chosen? Would you follow orders or fight to expose the betrayal?